So I don't know about you, but it's kind of the time of the quarter where I feel like a lot of folks are getting pretty worn out toward the finish line. You know, I'm kind of tired. And I also know that this is kind of a stressful time as you're balancing a lot of other exams, things to do, so on. And so I want to recognize that and try to make things as straightforward as possible so you know what to expect for this class. One thing that can help as you're starting to plan, right, is again, we don't have a big old exam for this course. Instead, that exam window next week from 10 to noon is just a chance for you to share what you put together for your final paper. I'm not, again, looking for a big, fancy presentation. My advice would just be to come in, maybe with a couple of notes about things that you want to share with your group. Again, it's much more informal and kind of based on discussion. And since I know there were a couple of people a little bit stressed about what to expect or what they should add to the conversation, I just wanted to give maybe a few questions that can help you as you're thinking about what you would like to share. One of them would be why you chose this conversation. So maybe there was a friend or family member that you were really curious about and wanted to learn a little bit more about. So you chose to get in touch with them and kind of find out their story. What was the situation? So you might think about the role that setting, like physical location, played, right? Was it in the dorms? Was it at a coffee shop where it was really loud and there was a lot of noise? Was it at somebody's home? So you can share a little bit about some of the context and setting there. You can share a little bit about the topic. What did you choose to address and bring to the table in that conversation? Again, you might be surprised by the way, if you haven't had your conversation yet, that it could go really differently than what you might have expected. So you might consider what was kind of a surprise to you. And then also be thinking about what stood out to you as you transcribe the conversation. So again, I know it's nails on a chalkboard to hear your own voice as you're working through the transcription, but there's a lot of things you might pick up on. Your own speaking style, listening, and so on. You might think, wow, I interrupt people a lot mid-sentence, and that's something you didn't know before. So there's things that you could learn from that process and use and choose to share with us. Again, I respect sort of the level of privacy and disclosure that you would like to bring in your transcription. So you can choose to share as much or as little as you'd like with us. A couple questions and points that came out in the drafts that I've seen so far. First of all, one way of thinking about how you're making sense of the conversation, right, is that it's not just about the content of the conversation. So for instance, maybe somebody's telling a story, and through the story they bring in a lot of ideas related to, say, the different stages of relationship development. Maybe you hear a lot from them in talking about their stories. But what's really interesting, right, and the thing you could hone in on, is what stands out to you about how that person is telling the story or how they're communicating, right? We use narratives to try to make sense of and give some type of direction to our lives, right? Oftentimes, people like to say that our lives, we understand our lives and ourselves because of the stories that we tell ourselves, right? So if you're having a conversation with somebody, they're disclosing and sharing parts of their life, the content of that is interesting, but also the way that they're choosing to talk about that is interesting too. So if you have a family member and they have a really challenging conversation, have a really challenging relationship with siblings, right? It's not just that they've had this great relationship, but maybe they have some harsh words to say about their sibling. Maybe they feel uncomfortable talking about it, or there's things that they leave out. So I definitely recommend, not just the things that the person says, but the ways that they choose to talk about it are things to consider there too. And then also think about what role you've played in the process. So for instance, how you're adding to the conversation, ideas that you choose to share with them, what you notice about what you're listening to, right? There's a lot of little details about verbal and nonverbal communication that you might notice through listening. For instance, when I did a similar activity with my dad, right, I found that I was frustrated because oftentimes he'd go off on tangents when I tried to talk to him about a topic, and I was like, oh, come back. I want to answer, I have this question answered. But then what I realized is that as a result of that, I was tuning out of the stories he was telling and the ways that those would link back to my original question, right? So the things I learned about how to be a better listener and better connect his ideas to the conversation. So be thinking about things that you are learning through that process as well. So, to kind of go over last class real quick, Monday's class was talking about interpersonal communication in the workplace, right? So that's helpful for you if you're using somebody like a coworker or colleague, somebody you know a little bit more professionally for this assignment. But it's also useful to be thinking about how work and workplace communication has evolved and changed over time with remote work, and some of the ways that we can be better communicators as we're working or moving on to settings where we're involved in more professional and workplace style communication, right? There's a lot of challenges and changes that we start to see in this type of communication over time as it relates to culture, identity, challenges, things like working remotely, and so on. So for today, right, we're kind of moving into our last main area of discussion, which is about, right, the dark side of communication. So our kind of defense against the dark arts on the ways that interpersonal communication can be negative, hurtful, harmful, and some of the ways that we might choose to respond to that, right? So we'll look at some examples, particularly surrounding hurtful and destructive communication as it relates to romantic and intimate relationships, right? Because that's an area where a lot of these things come into play. So again, it's a slightly dark note to end our main points in the class on, but I do think it's a really good way for us to bring some of these ideas together and to think about, now that we know a lot of the skills and strategies for being good and effective communicators, how we can use that to confront the issues like these that happen every day of our lives. So we'll be looking into that today and Friday. As a reminder, if you want to do the extra credit, which adds 20 points or 2% onto your grade and asks you to take an outside article to connect to the course, I really recommend getting started on that if you plan to do it. And please turn that in by the end of the day on Friday at Canvas. Again, it's optional, but it oftentimes helps people who are on the border of the grade that they want, or just gives an extra buffer if you're doing well in the class. On December 15th, right, you'll informally share. I've heard from a couple people who, for whatever reason, needed to leave early or might not be able to make it until slightly later. So if that applies to you, send me an email and let me know if you would prefer to go early or late given your travel restrictions. If you are not able to make this meeting, but you are able to make it through Zoom, send me a message. And if you can't do either of those, then I ask that you send me the video prior to that meeting time so that we can share that. That is a required part of your participation and attendance in the course. So I'm expecting everybody in some capacity to share their progress on this assignment. But I think it's a fun way for us to talk through a lot of these ideas. And then the following day, by the end of the day, the recording and reflection essay is turned in. This is also a great time, especially if you find as you get to dead week that you have some limitations on, or you have some time, right? Any makeup assignments that you need to catch up on, like weeks you notice that you don't have the full 20 points, you're welcome to still try to turn in those assignments to make up some of your points there. So that's kind of the last couple weeks in a nutshell, and some things to expect as you get into the final essay. I will say the grades are due and need to be formally submitted by noon on the 20th. So if you find that you're going to be submitting anything in the class late, please let me know as soon as possible so that I can make sure that your grade is updated in time. So I'll be getting that out there in the next few days. So, right, the dark side, right, Darth Vader, Star Wars, come to the dark side, we have cookies. The dark side is an interesting way of thinking about the challenges of effective interpersonal communication. So when we say like the dark side of interpersonal communication, what we mean is interpersonal communication that essentially brings relationships apart or creates problems in relationships and so on. And if you think about media, right, it's an incredibly popular topic and area of discussion that we see a lot. The dark side of communication is at times really romanticized and is a source of excitement. A lot of folks have mentioned watching the show You on Netflix, right, which gets into a lot of destructive and abusive patterns in relationships. But if we think about a lot of media that portrays kind of problematic or flawed characters, particularly like anti-hero type characters in shows like Breaking Bad or Mad Men, right? There's a lot of different ways that we look at these patterns of communication as a source of drama, right, and as a source of friction. And because these models are common, they're generational, and oftentimes they create a lot of problems for us in creating the relationships that we want, I think it's important for us to figure out what these are and what we can do about them, right? So it's communication that has negative outcomes. You can think about what we've been talking about so far in the class, things like relationship development, uncertainty reduction, social penetration theory, and all of these have been concerned with the idea that the more you talk with and get to know somebody, the closer you feel, the more connected you feel in your relationships. This is the opposite, right, where it's how communication can create separation and division. This is something that many of us have felt in a lot of the ways that social and political issues have been discussed, a way that I think in many ways has been magnified by COVID, right? Understanding some of these negative patterns helps us to better advocate for and deal with these issues as they come up in our lives, right? So being a good friend and a good supporter of somebody means acknowledging and addressing those problems when they happen. There's a lot of discussion surrounding call-outs, right, and publicly sort of identifying when somebody's communication is hurtful or destructive. And I think that that can be useful. Another way of thinking about it, right, is a call-in, where you use sort of identifying negative communication as an opportunity for a conversation and some steps for growth. And then the last thing, right, is that these negative patterns are important for self-reflexivity. That to some degree in our lives, we're doing some of these things. There's a lot of reasons, personally, psychologically, and so on, that might motivate that, but it helps us to think about what we can do to be better as communicators. So nobody's perfect at communicating. As we talk through some of these negative patterns, there are probably at least a few things that you've done personally and can continue to work on. I know I have things that I continue to want to develop as well in communication. So one of the key ideas here, right, is the idea of a secret test. And don't worry, we don't have a pop quiz. That's not the kind of secret test we're talking about, right? But instead, it's about the idea that oftentimes, especially when we feel insecurity in our relationships, we do a lot of different ways of testing out and seeing how strong those relationships are and how we fit in our relationships, right? And we can think about this if we think back to different attachment styles. You might recall that under a preoccupied attachment style, you care a lot about the other person, but you have low self-esteem, right? And oftentimes in those situations in particular, we will address our low self-esteem or concern through some of these strategies, because we want to feel like we're valued in the relationship. We might have a fear that the relationship will not last because we're not good enough, or we might have frustrations toward the other person, and the other person not giving in the ways that we would like them to. So tests are a way of us sort of figuring out the terrain and trying to address the relationship more broadly. So I want to talk about and give some examples of how each of these tests could be at play in our relationships. One of them is directness, and oftentimes this is a really constructive approach that can benefit our relationships, but not always. It depends on situation and context. So if you were in a relationship with somebody, right, and something is developing with that person, you might ask a question like, okay, where are we? You know, who are we? What is this? So oftentimes as relationships develop, there's an urge to try to define and figure out what that relationship would mean. Directness would be a way of, really putting a fine point on it and laying out what it is that you want to learn and figuring out things like boundaries. So in a lot of situations, that's a good thing because it shows that you're clear, you have a need and you want to see that fulfilled, and you're giving the other person enough respect to share what your concerns are. But it can also be a problem depending on things like culture and situation. One model of thinking about a lot of relationships is sort of like a game of tug of war, right? If somebody pulls forward really hard in a relationship, the other person tends to push back. So sometimes directness can be responded to with by using withdrawal. So somebody discloses, hey, I really like you, I like our relationship and where it's going, but I want to know, where are we, how do we define our relationship? And in response, the other person could be evasive, they could choose to end the relationship, to feel anxious, or to not have a good answer to the question. So one thing to think about with directness and engaging in a thoughtful way is thinking about how somebody's response to our communication can at times be withdrawal to direct approaches. Another thing to think about, right, is in a lot of collectivist cultures, including those outside the United States, maybe directness is frowned upon. So for instance, directness is more common when there's more of an individual and competitive focus. But if directness is seen as disrupting the harmony of the group, then it could be seen fairly negatively too. So there's some important considerations here about how directness can be useful, but requires us to think pretty carefully about the needs of the other person. The second idea here would be an endurance test, right? So endurance test would not be doing a marathon, but instead the idea that you are throwing a wrench at the relationship in order to get one of two things. Either the relationship is so strong that it can survive this issue, and you feel like, okay, now I feel secure in this relationship because I know that this person loves or cares about me enough to do this, or the relationship does not survive, in which case it is able to end the relationship. Because a lot of people might not be direct in wanting a relationship to end, they might choose to engage in destructive behavior that forces the other person out, right, or pushes them away. For instance, if somebody would start like flirting or dating or cheating with another person for the purpose of trying to break up the current relationship, that would be an example of endurance, right? The other approach would be to engage in behavior, again, something like behavior that goes outside of what's agreed, things like flirting or getting involved with somebody else as a way to get the other person jealous and try to get the other person to really show up for the relationship and say, hey, I really care about you and I want this relationship to continue and I'm frustrated. So endurance is a challenging and at times destructive test because we're trying to figure out just how much the person cares about us by making the relationship more complicated and forcing them to do more work, right? So that can be one pattern we see a lot. Another idea here would be an indirect suggestion. So a classic example that I like to think about in a lot of Western approaches to something like marriage, right, is that in a lot of weddings, there's this sort of customary throwing of the bouquet. So, for instance, a bouquet of flowers is thrown, the idea here being that whoever catches it is likely to be the next person who might get married themselves. And that's a trope we see in a lot of romantic comedies and so on. So an indirect suggestion might be, hey, I caught the bouquet, and then there's another, the person they're dating has this shocked or fearful look on their face, right? So that would be an example of an indirect suggestion. Oftentimes we use indirect suggestions. If you think back to the model of relationships building up, right, moving to things like exploring to more of a formal bonding stage, right, where there's a public display. Oftentimes when people want the relationship to go a step further, they'll use indirect suggestions to help get there. So they might say, oh, it's so great to have you over. Wouldn't it be so much more convenient if we were living in the same place, right? So little hints and comments like that aren't directly asking for something, but are trying to get the other person to think about that, can oftentimes be used. You know, sometimes, again, depending on the situation, that can be useful as a way to test the waters and to figure out what somebody else is comfortable with. Somebody might say, yeah, you know, that would be great. I'd love to think about doing that sometime and moving in together, right? Other times, it can be used in a way that creates unrealistic expectations. In particular, if something's hinted at indirectly or maybe passive-aggressively, it creates a challenge for the other person because they might not pick up on that or understand what it is that somebody's trying to share, right? So one possible source of conflict could come about if the other person didn't understand the message or the thing that somebody was trying to do. So that could be a challenge, right? Is the indirect suggestions can test the waters, but can also not be understood, especially as we consider how things like culture, gender, and so on could play into it. A public presentation, right? So again, I grew up at a time where Facebook was used by a very large portion of my peers, and so the idea of going Facebook or social media official was a huge deal. So-and-so and so-and-so are in a relationship. And one of the most interesting things that I found about that growing up, right, was that you'd have this big, it'd show up on your feed that people were dating. We still see that to some extent, right, for people that use social media or post something like an engagement ring on Instagram, right? But it's probably not as big of a deal, right? Or it's not seen by the same group of people. One thing that was really funny to me when this happened, in high school in particular, was that people would post that they were in a relationship, and then one of the two people would freak out that they were tagged, and then try to get it taken down, or be like, oh, we're not ready to go public yet, or be really concerned, right? That would be an example of public presentation. In particular, public presentation is a way that one person in a relationship puts pressure on the other person to go public in a way that they might not be comfortable or familiar with yet, right? So they're asking them to go public to share that we're in a relationship, and the other person maybe wants to keep things a little bit more private, or isn't in that place yet, or doesn't see the relationship at that stage yet. So a public announcement can add to those feelings of pressure. So another example, right? Again, if you've seen some of those silly, Hallmark, Lifetime holiday movies, I recently watched one on Netflix called Single All the Way, and it was a very good example of this type of approach. A lot of these holiday films have people, main characters who are coming home for the holidays, and they're looking for, hey, are you dating anyone? And the premise, I swear, of every one of these movies is that there's a friend who or person that agrees to join them and fake being their partner. And then when they go home for the holidays, they actually fall in love, right? The idea of a public presentation then would be, oh, I'm bringing this person over for the holidays. We're dating. Isn't that great? Just stop asking whether or not I'm single. Separation, right? So separation, you might be familiar with the common phrase, distance makes the heart grow fonder. There are a lot of logistical and practical reasons why separation might happen, right? Some of you might be feeling that as you're transitioning into the college experience and might be dealing with relationships that are a lot more remote than they were before. We've definitely felt that with COVID. But separation is more about using physical distance to test the strength of the relationship. One major example of this would be something like ghosting, right? Where you avoid messaging someone for, a period of time, and then by doing so, you get the other person a little bit anxious and interested and really trying to reach out to you. So at times, right, using separation is a way to force the other person to give. Again, if you think about it kind of like tug of war, right? If you pull back, the idea is that the other person pushes forward and tries to initiate more contact. So it can sometimes be destructive if using physical distance is a way that people are trying to get the other person to give more. And then a third-party test, right? So there's a lot of situations in which like using that can be really healthy. For instance, dating, right? Some people might have like a friend who meets the person somewhat early on in order to get kind of an outsider perspective and make sure that the relationship is healthy. Like, I like this person, but do you think this person is okay? There's even like a trope, right, where some people talk about how, hey, you know, you passed my friend's test, my friend likes you, so you're probably a good person. So a third-party test can be useful a lot of times, but again, can also create pressure if that third person is not in on it or not willing to take on that kind of role, or the person that you're getting to know feels a little bit uncomfortable. So a third-party test would be an example, bringing in an outsider to talk about the relationship. Triangle test, though, is probably one of the more destructive ones, right? The triangle test, again, my parents came from a counseling and psychology background and always told me that like groups of 3 can be really challenging sometimes because 2 people can gang up on the third, right? And unevenness can be an issue. In that way, one example here is manipulating a third person, such as using gossip, asking personal questions, in order to try to find out more information about the relationship, right? So, what have they said about me? Would be an example of doing that, right? And that can be destructive for a couple reasons. First of all, it kind of betrays the trust of the person that you were talking to, because by bringing in a third person to ask questions, right, you're trying to get that outsider perspective and information about them that might be confidential. And it also puts a lot of pressure on the third person to have to share or disclose information about the relationship that they might not otherwise be comfortable doing. So these different types of tests are not always a bad thing, right? In fact, many of them, like directness or a third-party test, can be useful as we're establishing trust and building a good relationship. The trick here is that these have the potential of going really badly, right? Where somebody tries to publicly share a relationship and not everybody's on the same page. Or the use of, you know, throwing a wrench in the relationship is meant to show how much the other person cares. So, again, these aren't totally good or bad, but these types of tests that we use definitely have an effect of creating pressure on our relationships. Another key idea, right, that I think it's important for us to think about as we're examining some of the negative parts of communication are the steps involved in effective apology. And I don't think this is something that we talk about a whole lot very well, especially when there's been a lot of kind of celebrity apology and discussion about whether or not celebrities should or should not apologize for behavior, right? So I think a good apology has a few different parts. One of them is showing personal responsibility, right? Is saying, hey, I messed up, this is my fault. Another idea of showing remorse, that you care about the impact that what you did had on the other person. Hey, I went behind your back and I asked a friend about you. I know that that may have hurt your trust. And a direct request for forgiveness. Will you forgive me? We work through this together. One important idea here, I think something that's a good idea to consider, is that not everybody is ready to forgive either immediately or even further into the future, right? Oftentimes, especially if there's significant harm, forgiveness takes time. And it takes, thinking through the issue, and oftentimes requires the other person to feel like there's a way to prevent that from happening again. So these steps, I think, are important in thinking about a good apology, because you see a lot of bad examples of this, right? One of the classic examples of a bad and kind of empty apology is, I'm sorry you feel that way, right? Or, I'm sorry that the effect of this message was that it hurt you. We oftentimes get this in a lot of like PR corporate speak when companies are trying to avoid like legal liability from taking responsibility. So this can be a big issue, right? It's an apology that doesn't really feel like an apology. Oftentimes it's missing the responsibility step, right? Of somebody acknowledging and stepping up to the role that they played in the process. As my other class brought up, right, a good example of an empty apology would be any apology made by the Kardashians, right? So an empty apology is pretty common But I think another kind of issue that we see, right, is the challenge between intention and effect, right? Oftentimes, especially when we're apologizing, we might say, you know, I really didn't mean to hurt you. And that can be a good sentiment, right? It can be a good idea to share in a relationship that you've had a negative impact on the other person and you didn't mean to. It helps them feel like, okay, you care about me enough that you don't want this to be a thing. But oftentimes, right, that doesn't always get at the impact of what it is that you said or did, right? One of the examples that I like to use to think about this is if you're walking down a hall and say you accidentally bump into somebody and they fall over, right? Intentionality, I did not intend to bump into you, sure. It shows that you are not trying to be hostile. But at the same time, that person is still like on the floor and still needs some help up, right? Impact still matters, even if you didn't intend to hurt somebody. And I think one of the challenges about communicating well is matching your intent with your impact, right? For instance, using something like a slur, for instance, a homophobic slur, is challenging. You might not intend to use that in casual conversation in a way that hurts people. But, you know, you might say, hey, you know, I'm somebody with a disability. The R word has been used in a really derogatory way, and I don't appreciate that, even though I know you didn't mean to do so negatively. So there's a lot of challenges with apologies. We can think of a lot of examples of apologies. For instance, you know, a lot of celebrities and famous figures. Bill Clinton did a fairly major apology, right, following perjury in the Monica Lewinsky scandal. One major limitation, though, is that he doesn't actually directly say, I'm sorry, in the text of that. You think about other figures, for instance, Lance Armstrong, or Tiger Woods, right, who were a lot of famous figures who had major apologies come up. Very recent example, you might think of Travis Scott, right, and the case of the auditorium at Space World causing people to die through suffocation, and some of the apology work he's done through channels like YouTube in order to try to address the issue. In fact, there's sometimes a trope, like a YouTube apology, right, where there's this like very emotive and dramatic response that oftentimes tends to focus more on the emotions of the person issuing the apology rather than like the role of responsibility. I've intentionally avoided watching any sort of video associated with Jake Paul, but I have heard that that's that genre. So I'll take other people's words on that one. So one example of some of the challenges in a kind of weird case was there was a U.S. congressman who was somewhat tragically named, given the story, Anthony Weiner, and he was in the U.S. House of Representatives, and he was one of the highest profile cases several years ago, the sexting scandal. It was really weird because his Twitter started posting some like really weird and inappropriate photos, and he said he was hacked, and then it turned out that he had logged into the wrong account, was trying to sex somebody, and photos went public. Also really weird because in this scenario, his like code name and pseudonym was Carlos Danger, which is kind of bizarre, right? But as an example of a really high profile case of internet infidelity, right? Of using things like sexual energy outside of a relationship in a way that hurts the relationship and pretending, you know, that it won't have any harm or problem if it's discovered. And that's been a really interesting and kind of challenging and murky way that we've seen these issues in communications develop, right? Is that for some people, the idea of something like sexting or, you know, communicating and sharing messages online, if it's not actually physical, right, for some people might be seen as fine, for other people might violate the agreement of the relationship, but definitely adds a complicated layer and something that has to be agreed about and talked about in a relationship a lot more. There's been a stereotype over the last several decades that I think has been pretty definitively disproven that men care more about sexual infidelity and women care more about emotional infidelity, which again is not really the case. In fact, they might matter depending more on things like culture and the nature of the relationship, the agreement of the relationship, right? Sexual infidelity, of course, being physically cheating in whatever way that might be with the agreement. And then emotional infidelity, not like sharing care or disclosure or engagement with that other person. And so either way, when something like this happens, generally speaking, statistically in like psychology and communication research, open disclosure and discussion, particularly the person like choosing to openly fess up and disclose what happened without any sort of prompt or necessity to do so, is generally seen as the best outcome, right? Again, forgiveness and reconciliation can only go so far. It doesn't always work, right? In the case of Tiger Woods and his wife at the time, they attempted to work through the process, but ended up divorcing. So it doesn't always work. But that open discussion oftentimes has been seen as a more positive way to deal with situations like that if they occur. So one of the other ideas that I want to get into is the idea of hurtful messages. And we've been through a lot of these in our own lives. I think probably know them pretty well, so I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail about each. But I think they're nevertheless helpful for us as we're thinking about the challenges of communicating with other people respectfully. An evaluation, right, is the idea you're not worth my time, or making some type of judgment or calculation on the other person about their value, worth, and so on. One example would be in a lot of athletics, right? Sometimes coaches will kind of be verbally harassing or frustrating, right? Like, show me that you deserve to be here, right? And comments like that that are designed to try to motivate students, but can also be disruptive. So evaluations are making statements about the worth of the other person, oftentimes attacking their self-esteem. Accusations, right? Saying this is all your fault. You're the one responsible for this. That can be especially a challenge in a relationship where there's issues of accountability and acknowledging how both people might have contributed to an issue. So pointing a finger at one person can definitely be a challenge of accusation. A directive, right? Asking somebody to do something, especially as an ultimatum, right? Saying, you should just leave and never come back. I never want to see your face again, right? Is like a meme about don't touch me or don't come near me and my daughter ever again or something like that. Right? There's a lot of examples of how directives are used to try to establish hard lines, and that can sometimes, again, be a useful way of managing a destructive relationship, but also can be used to set boundaries in a way that hurts the other person. An informative statement, right? Nothing wrong with being informative in general, but it can be hurtful if an informative statement is meant to share gossip or to reveal information about somebody else that has the intention of harming them. So there's something you should know about reading. Again, I watch Bachelor, Bachelorette because I'm basic like that. There's a really weird trend, right, where there's drama on these shows, and typically there'll be like a person that comes in and is like, oh, you should hear some of the things they're saying about you. And I'm not sure everybody's intentions are honest, right? There's a lot of ways that informative statements are presented as somebody trying to reveal and share important information about the relationship, but are designed to hurt, right, relationships overall. A statement of desire, right, is oftentimes the sort of mic drop that somebody gives where they share information, especially at the conclusion of a relationship, that attempts to cause hurt, right? I never liked your music anyway. It's like those little statements that show, well, I never really wanted to be with you. I actually wanted to be with this person. And again, by disclosing somebody's preference or feelings could be designed to hurt too. An advising statement, right? So that could tie back to what we mentioned on Monday, right? Where we talked about how through microaggressions, oftentimes there's situations where a statement is made with stereotypes about a particular group, right? So for instance, saying, oh, you should take a math class based on somebody's race or gender, right, would be an example of using an advising statement in a hurtful way, right? Another example, if you think about the idea of gaslighting, that's gained a lot of discussion in recent years, And it's defined as trying to get somebody to doubt their senses and perception of reality. Did you hear that? Oh, no, it was nothing, right? Getting people to doubt their senses can at times be done through using advising statements like this one. Trying to inform people about something, but doing so in a way that guides them in a wrong or hurtful direction. A question, again, why haven't you been promoted yet? Or why are you still single? In a lot of those rom-coms where, the person goes home for the holidays and parents are, where is the person that you're seeing? Why are you still single? It's not really meant to be positive. It's meant to cause that person to feel guilt or frustration or doubt about where they are as people. Threats, right? That's fairly straightforward. Move it or lose it. Bullies, right, oftentimes will take on this role of issuing threats toward people if they do or do not do something. Jokes, right? So again, we've had a lot of discussion in recent years about the challenges of humor and jokes and the problems, right, where if a joke is directed toward a particular individual or population and they're not in on it or they don't feel comfortable with it, then it can create some really negative relationships going forward, right? So maybe somebody says, makes a joke about somebody's hair and gives them like a mean nickname, calls them mop head, right? One way of feeling and dealing with that frustration might be to identify and say, hey, I don't feel comfortable with this joke. Or if somebody is in on it and feels okay with that nickname, then they might not see that as a negative joke. Lies, right? Probably the most straightforward. We don't know each other if you're talking about a close friend or somebody that you've spent regular time with. Using lies in relationships can be challenging because there are situations where like a white lie or a small lie can be good. For instance, somebody's really bad at cooking and you're like, oh, this is delicious. You did a great job because you don't want to hurt their feelings. But lies can also snowball, right? Where lies build on each other and become more elaborate and create greater deception over time. So there's three major ways that we can respond to and deal with hurtful messages as they come up, right? One of the first would be an active verbal. You can think about it as trying to directly deal with the threat or problem. One example would be to attack somebody else, right? So if somebody calls you a name, you respond by calling them a name back, which is not always a good idea, right? Defending yourself, saying, hey, I wasn't trying to be misleading, I just had the wrong information at the time. We're asking for an explanation. Hey, I heard that you went behind my back. Why did you do that? What's up? So that would be an active verbal response. An acquiescent response would be something like crying, right, conceding, or apologizing. Again, sometimes these approaches can be useful, where you're showing genuine remorse and a desire to do better. But again, there are also situations where emotions can get in the way of or substitute for providing some level of apology or support going forward. In vulnerable responses, you can think about as the sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me phrase. It's commonly used kind of in grade school, right? Of ignoring, choosing to laugh at something, or just showing that something didn't impact you. So if somebody calls you a name, sort of shrugging it off. And again, there's a lot of ways that people might perform that and not actually feel neutral about it, right? They might try to deal with or prevent bullying by responding in that way, even though it does affect them. Or there might be situations where they do show that they don't care, right? The idea being that if somebody does not have a strong response to negative communication like bullying, that maybe they'll get bored and stop bothering you. So these are three different approaches that we can take that, again, depend on situation and context and what way might be the most appropriate for that situation. So what I'd like you to do now is you can either write or type this, but I want to take some time for us to think about some of these approaches a little bit more. So we've talked about these different types of hurtful messages. And I want you to think about, in your own opinion, of these hurtful messages, which has the potential to do the most harm? And why do you think that is? And then secondarily, of the three kinds of responses to hurtful messages that we talked about today, which might be the best to respond to the hurtful message that you picked here in number 1? Again, there's no like single correct answer here. There's a lot of variation in how you might think about this, but you can pick one that you think is especially hurtful and the way you could respond to that. Oh, did you have a question? Yeah.
Yeah, this is like for attendance for.
Yes, yes. So,
Email it to you?
yeah, so you can write or type this. I'll be grabbing this in a bit for attendance. Just to recap some of the things that we discussed for today. We talked about kind of the commonality of things like hurtful messages, including the use of tests to try to assess the relationship overall. We've talked a little bit about some of the ways that we respond to and address hurtful messages, like a more direct style, or communication that shows that it didn't impact you. And then hurtful messages, as we've talked about, can have a lot of these impacts on the relationship as a whole. Again, context matters. This type of communication can be a force for good, but we have to think carefully about the impact that our communication has on those around us. For next class, we'll be reading Wrench 508 to 19. That's the last major reading in our last content class. And we'll be looking at more negative patterns of communication this Friday. I will also make a promise this Friday that I'm going to wear a silly holiday sweater, so that'll be fun. Gotta help after I didn't have a Halloween costume. So take some time if you still need to wrap up. Go ahead and pass forward your activity for the day once you're done with that. And I look forward to seeing you all again on Friday. Best of luck surviving this challenging week, really close to the finish line, and keep up the good work on your final papers. Thank you.